March 6, 1944, 27,000 feet above Berlin. The sky is burning. Flak bursts tear through the formation like black flowers blooming in hell. Inside a B-17 flying fortress, 9 men feel the shockwave of an 88 shell exploding 30 feet off their starboard wing. Metal fragments punch through aluminum skin. The intercom crackles with urgent voices. And at the controls, a 22-year-old pilot from Iowa makes a decision that will defy every training manual ever written. By March of 1944, the air war over Nazi Germany had reached a terrifying crescendo. The United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force was deep into Operation Argument, what historians would later call Big Week, a coordinated campaign to cripple German aircraft production and break the Luftwaffe's defensive grip on the Reich. Every day, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators climbed into the frigid European sky, their bellies loaded with high explosives, their crews knowing the statistics that commanders tried to hide. A 71% casualty rate for bomber crews completing their required 25 missions. Berlin represented the ultimate target. The Nazi capital, defended by over 400 heavy anti-aircraft guns and fighter squadrons pulled from across occupied Europe, had become a fortress in the sky. The flak was so dense that pilots described it as a black carpet you could walk on. Fighter attacks came in waves. Me-109s and FW-190s diving from 30,000 feet with 20 cannons blazing, their tracer rounds stitching lines of fire through bomber formations. The casualties were staggering. On a single raid in March, the 8th Air Force lost 69 heavy bombers, 690 men killed, missing, or captured in a single afternoon. Replacement crews arrived at English air bases still wearing their stateside uniforms, rushed into combat before they'd even unpacked their footlockers. The average life expectancy of a B-17 crew over Germany in early 1944 was 15 missions, 15 flights before the odds caught up with you. Into this maelstrom came thousands of young American aviators, many of them barely out of high school. They came from farms and factories, from city streets and small towns, carrying with them the hopes of a nation fighting for survival. Some were college graduates with engineering degrees. Others had never been more than 50 miles from their birthplace until the day they boarded a troopship bound for England. The bomber crews of 1944 represented democracy in its purest form. Rich and poor, educated and self-taught, city boys and farm kids, all strapped into the same aluminum tube, facing the same lethal sky. In the crucible of combat, reputation meant nothing. College credentials meant nothing. Your hometown size meant nothing. All that mattered was whether you could keep your aircraft flying when the fighters came, when the flak burst, when engines died and control cables snapped. This is the story of one such crew and one particular pilot who became the subject of ridicule among his squadron mates. They called him farm boy and tractor jockey. They laughed at his Iowa accent, his awkward social manner, his simple way of explaining complex flying maneuvers using agricultural metaphors. He didn't drink with the other officers. He didn't chase women in the local pubs. He spent his free time in the link trainer, practicing emergency procedures that the veteran pilots said were impossible in a fully loaded B-17. His name was Lieutenant Robert "Bob" Hughes, and most of his fellow pilots thought he would wash out or die within his first 3 missions. They had no way of knowing that his unconventional thinking, born from years of coaxing temperamental farm equipment to perform beyond its designed limits, would soon rewrite the tactical manual for bomber evasion. But here's where it gets interesting. On March 6, 1944, over the burning heart of Berlin, Hughes would prove that sometimes the best training doesn't come from a manual. Sometimes it comes from a lifetime of making the impossible merely difficult, of asking machinery to perform miracles, of refusing to accept that "can't be done" is the final answer. This is the story of the day a farm boy taught the Luftwaffe and his own command structure that a B-17 flying fortress could roll. To understand what Lieutenant Robert Hughes accomplished on that March afternoon, we need to go back to the fundamental problem facing every B-17 pilot over Nazi Germany in 1944. The bomber formation was a death trap disguised as a defensive strategy. The doctrine was simple on paper. Bombers would fly in tight formations called combat boxes, staggered groupings of 18 to 27 aircraft, each positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire from their .50 caliber machine guns. The theory held that this concentration of defensive firepower would make attacking fighters pay such a heavy price that most would break off their passes before scoring hits. The bomber stream would proceed to target, drop its payload, and return home, losing perhaps 5–7% of the force to fighter action and flak. The reality was far more lethal. German fighter tactics had evolved rapidly. By early 1944, Luftwaffe pilots had learned to exploit every weakness in the American formation. They attacked from 12 o'clock high, head-on passes at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, giving bomber gunners less than 3 seconds to track and fire. They focused on the lead aircraft, knowing that killing the leader would scatter the formation. They used 21 cm rockets launched from beyond machine gun range, air-to-air bombing, and coordinated attacks that overwhelmed the defensive guns. The B-17 itself, for all its legendary toughness, had significant vulnerabilities. It was not a nimble aircraft. Fully loaded with fuel, bombs, ammunition, and crew, it weighed 65,000 pounds, more than 3 times its empty weight. Its cruising speed over target was 182 miles per hour. Its turning radius was measured in miles, not feet. The aircraft handled, as one pilot described it, like a loaded dump truck with wings. Standard evasion tactics were limited and often ineffective. If fighters attacked, you maintained formation discipline. You did not break away. You did not attempt violent maneuvers. The B's flight manual explicitly warned against steep banks, barrel rolls, or inverted flight with a combat load. Such maneuvers would stress the airframe beyond design limits, potentially causing structural failure. They would scatter bombs across friendly territory. They would break formation integrity, leaving you isolated and vulnerable. So bomber pilots flew straight and level through the flak, through the fighter attacks, through the tracers and the cannon shells and the screaming metal. They held formation even as aircraft beside them exploded, even as hydraulic fluid and blood sprayed across their windscreens, even as wounded gunners screamed over the intercom. To break formation was to die alone. To hold formation was to trust that your brothers would make it through with you or die trying. The problem was that this strategy treated bomber crews as ammunition, acceptable losses, a cost of doing business. Command calculated that if 300 bombers dropped their loads on target and 30 didn't come home, the mission succeeded. The mathematics of attrition warfare, the cold calculus of strategic bombing. Individual survival depended on factors largely beyond a pilot's control. Your position in the formation, the accuracy of enemy flak prediction, whether a fighter pilot chose your aircraft for his attack run, whether the oxygen system failed at altitude, whether an engine caught fire, whether the bomb bay doors jammed, whether 100 other mechanical or human failures occurred in the 2-hour window over enemy territory. What the doctrine didn't account for was initiative, individual decision-making, the possibility that a pilot might refuse to accept that his only options were fly straight and die or break formation and die. But the solution would come from an unexpected place, from a young man who had spent his formative years learning that machines, like stubborn mules, sometimes respond better to cleverness than to force. Enter Robert Franklin Hughes, born September 1921 in a farmhouse 12 miles outside Des Moines, Iowa. No running water, no electricity until he was 9 years old. His father worked 240 acres of corn and soybeans, struggling through the Depression with the same grim determination that kept most American farmers from simply walking away from land that barely fed their families. Bob Hughes grew up with machinery that shouldn't work but had to. Tractors held together with baling wire and prayer. Combines that broke down in the middle of harvest, with weather moving in and crops dying in the field. There was no manual for a 1928 John Deere that had been rebuilt 5 times with parts scavenged from 3 other machines. There was no technical support hotline. There was just you, the machine, and the absolute necessity of making it function. He learned to think in 3 dimensions before he knew there was a term for it. How weight shifts when you turn. How momentum carries you past where you intend to go. How every control input creates a reaction somewhere else in the system. A tractor pulling a loaded grain wagon down a muddy hillside teaches physics lessons that no textbook can replicate. You learn what happens when you brake too hard, turn too sharp, or accelerate when your weight distribution is wrong. You learn by consequence, by near disaster, by the sick feeling in your stomach when 2 tons of steel and grain start sliding sideways toward a fence line. His mother taught school in town. She brought home books, aviation magazines, popular mechanics, technical journals about the new science of aeronautics. Bob read about the barnstormers, the air mail pilots, the evolving theories of flight control. He built model aircraft from balsa wood and tissue paper, flying them in the pasture, studying how control surfaces affected flight paths. He once told his younger sister that an airplane was just a tractor that refused to stay on the ground. The same principles of leverage, thrust, and control, just applied in 3 dimensions instead of 2. When he turned 18 in 1939, Europe was already at war. He knew America would follow. He walked into the Army Air Corps recruiting office in Des Moines 3 days after Pearl Harbor and requested pilot training. The recruiter looked at his high school transcript, mediocre grades, no college, father listed as farmer, and tried to steer him toward mechanic school. Hughes politely insisted. He took the written exam and scored in the 94th percentile for spatial reasoning. He passed the physical. They sent him to primary flight training at Coleman, Texas, in March 1942. His instructors noticed something unusual. Hughes flew by feel rather than by instruments. He could sense when the aircraft was approaching a stall by the pressure on the control yoke, the sound of wind over the wings, the subtle vibration through the airframe. He had an instinctive understanding of energy management, how altitude traded for speed, how speed traded for maneuverability, how every action cost you something that you'd need to recover later. He flew smoothly, efficiently, wasting no motion, no energy. But he also asked strange questions. Could the trainer recover from inverted flight? What happened if you rolled during a climbing turn? How much G-force could the wings sustain before structural failure? His instructors told him to focus on the curriculum. Aerobatics were for fighters, not for multi-engine bombers. Bomber pilots needed to fly straight, level, and predictable. That's what the doctrine required. Hughes nodded and said nothing. But on his off-duty hours, he spent time with the maintenance crews, learning how airframes were stressed, where structural members carried load, what the actual safety margins were versus what the manual specified. He learned that aircraft, like tractors, were often capable of more than their designers publicly admitted, that the difference between maximum rated performance and actual failure point was usually significant. That machines built for war had hidden reserves, if you knew how to find them. He graduated in the top third of his class and received his wings in November 1942. They assigned him to B-17s. His squadron mates took one look at the quiet Iowa farm kid and started making jokes. He didn't correct them. He just listened, learned, and practiced maneuvers that most bomber pilots never considered attempting. However, what happened during his first training flight in a fully loaded B would shock everyone involved. The first B-17 Flying Fortress that Robert Hughes flew was a war-weary bird at MacDill Field, Florida. Aircraft number 423067, nicknamed Patches for obvious reasons. She'd returned from 20 missions over Europe, been patched and rebuilt, and sent stateside for training duties. She groaned and rattled and leaked hydraulic fluid, but she flew. More importantly, she had the weight and handling characteristics of a combat-loaded bomber. December 1942. Hughes' instructor pilot, Captain James Morley, was a veteran of the 97th Bomb Group with 8 missions over North Africa to his credit. He'd seen what happened when pilots deviated from doctrine, when they tried to be clever or heroic. He'd scraped friends out of crashed aircraft and written letters to widows. He believed in the manual, in procedure, in doing things by the book because the book was written in blood. First flight, standard training profile. Takeoff, climb to altitude, practice formation positions, return to base. Routine. Except Hughes kept asking about control response at different speeds and weights. What happened if you reduced power in a turn? How did the aircraft handle with asymmetric thrust, one engine dead, opposite engine at full power? Morley answered mechanically, wondering if this farm kid understood what he was asking. At 10,000 feet, Hughes requested permission to test maximum bank angle. Morley approved 30 degrees, standard combat maneuvering limit for a B-17. Hughes nodded, then smoothly rolled the aircraft into a 45-degree bank, holding altitude and airspeed steady through the turn. Morley's hand went to the co-pilot's yoke, ready to intervene. But Hughes flew the maneuver perfectly, trimming the aircraft, managing power settings, bringing her back to level flight without losing 50 feet of altitude. "The manual says 30 degrees maximum," Morley said flatly. "The manual was written for fully loaded bombers over target," Hughes replied. "We're carrying training weight. Structural margin is higher." Morley didn't respond immediately. The kid was technically correct. The B-17's wings could handle much more than standard procedures allowed. But doctrine wasn't about what the aircraft could theoretically do. It was about what 300 bombers in a formation could reliably do, flown by pilots of varying skill levels under combat stress, with wounded crew and damaged systems. They returned to base. Morley filed his training report. Student demonstrates above-average control sensitivity, tendency to test aircraft limitations, recommend emphasis on formation discipline and procedural compliance. The reputation started then. The other pilot trainees saw Hughes spending extra time in the Link Trainer, a primitive flight simulator that most pilots considered a necessary evil. He practiced emergency procedures that the instructors said were academic exercises. Full engine-out landings, asymmetric thrust control, steep banks with simulated battle damage. His squadron mates went to the officers' club. Hughes went to the flight line, sitting in parked B-17s, memorizing control positions, testing how much force was required for each input, building muscle memory for switches and levers in darkness. They called him Farmer Bob. They said he was overthinking things, that he'd freeze up when the flak started flying, that all his simulator time wouldn't mean anything when a Me-109 put 20 rounds through the cockpit. Some of it was good-natured ribbing. Some of it carried an edge of resentment. The farm kid who asked too many questions, the quiet one who didn't fit in, the pilot who seemed to think he knew better than the tactical manuals written by combat veterans. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a Harvard graduate and Hughes bunkmate, summed up the prevailing opinion one evening in January 1943. Bob's a decent stick, but he's got this idea that flying a bomber is like driving a tractor. He doesn't understand that when you're in formation over Germany, individual initiative gets people killed. You fly the mission profile. You trust the doctrine. You don't try to be a fighter pilot in a 40-ton aircraft. Hughes heard the comments. He never argued, never defended himself, never explained his thinking. He just kept practicing, kept learning, kept preparing for a situation that most bomber pilots prayed would never happen. The moment when the doctrine failed and survival required something the manual said was impossible. But its real test was about to come in actual combat. June 12, 1943, Molesworth, England. The 303rd Bomb Group, known as Hell's Angels, received a new crew straight from the replacement depot. Aircraft Commander, 2nd Lieutenant Robert F. Hughes. Co-pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Daniel McCarthy, a Boston kid who'd washed out of fighter training for being too tall for a P-47 cockpit. Navigator, 2nd Lieutenant James Chen from San Francisco. Bombardier, 2nd Lieutenant Howard Howie Klein from Brooklyn. And 5 enlisted men. Engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and tail gunner. All teenagers, all terrified, all trying not to show it. Their assigned aircraft, B-17F serial number 4230631, nicknamed Queen of Diamonds by her previous crew. 4 of whom were dead. 3 more were in German POW camps. The aircraft bore the scars, patched holes in the fuselage, replaced sections of wing skin, a new number 3 engine. She was available because her previous pilot had been killed by flak over Bremen. Nobody mentioned this to the new crew. Hughes' first mission came on June 22, 1943. Target, the synthetic rubber plant at Huls, Germany. Intelligence briefed them on expected fighter opposition, maybe 20 Me-109s from the local defense wing. Light to moderate flak. Estimated losses, 5 to 7 aircraft from the 300 bomber strike force. Routine mission by mid-1943 standards, which meant there was an excellent chance they'd die. The formation assembly took 90 minutes. 300 bombers circling over England, stacking into combat boxes, each aircraft fighting for position, wingtip to wingtip in visibility that barely reached a quarter mile. Hughes flew his assigned position, low right in the second element with the same methodical precision he'd shown in training. McCarthy, his co-pilot, kept glancing over, expecting nervousness, mistakes, the typical new pilot jitters. Hughes' hands on the controls remained steady. They crossed the Dutch coast at 24,000 feet. The first flak appeared 10 minutes later, black puffs blooming in the sky ahead, looking harmless until you realized each burst was a cloud of razor-sharp steel fragments traveling at 3,000 feet per second. The aircraft shuddered as concussion waves hit. Hughes held formation, held altitude, held heading, by the book. The fighters came at 1:37 p.m. 6 Me-109s diving from 30,000 feet straight through the formation. Cannon fire and machine gun tracers laced the sky. The B-17 to Hughes' left, Memphis Mama, staggered as 20 rounds punched through her nose section. Plexiglass and metal fragments sprayed across Queen of Diamonds' windscreen. The intercom erupted with gunner calls. Fighters 11 o'clock high. Fighters coming in level. fighters 6 o'clock low. Hughes flew through it, didn't flinch, didn't break formation, didn't deviate. His engineer, Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski, watching from the top turret position, later said the pilot flew like a machine. No wasted motion, no panic, just constant micro-adjustments to hold position while aircraft around them burned and fell. Memphis Mama went down first. One engine on fire, half the tail section shot away, crew bailing out at 23,000 feet over enemy territory. Another B-17, 3 positions ahead, took a direct flak hit. She simply exploded. 70,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, bombs, and 10 men converted to falling debris in less than a second. No parachutes, no time. Queen of Diamonds took hits. A burst of machine gun fire stitched across the waist section, wounding one gunner. Flak fragment penetrated the nose, missing Klein's head by 18 inches. The number 4 engine lost oil pressure, not dead but sick, temperature rising toward the red line. Hughes feathered the propeller, adjusted trim, compensated with rudder pressure, kept formation. They reached the target. Bomb bay doors opened. Klein called bombs away at 2:14 p.m. The aircraft lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of high explosives fell toward the synthetic rubber plant below. Formation turned for home. The fighters came back, pressing attacks all the way to the coast. Queen of Diamonds landed at Molesworth at 5:47 p.m. with 3 engines, 14 holes in the fuselage, 1 wounded crewman, and 9 very shaken men who just learned what combat actually meant. Hughes shut down the engines, climbed out of the aircraft, walked to debriefing, gave his report in a flat, factual monotone, times, headings, fighter attacks, flak concentrations, bomb results. The intelligence officer asked how he felt about his first mission. Hughes thought for a moment, then said, "We maintained formation discipline. Aircraft performed adequately. Crew performed adequately. Ready for the next mission." The other pilots exchanged glances. The farm boy had survived. That didn't mean they'd misjudged him. It just meant he'd been lucky. One mission didn't prove anything. They'd see how he handled it when things really went wrong. This was just the beginning. What came next would cement his growing reputation and sharpen the divide between those who trusted doctrine and those who trusted their instincts. By December 1943, Robert Hughes had flown 17 missions. Queen of Diamonds had been patched, rebuilt, and patched again so many times that her original aluminum skin was barely visible under the repair plates. The crew had gelled into a tight unit. They knew each other's voices on the intercom, anticipated each other's movements, functioned as a single organism spread across 40 feet of aircraft. They'd bombed submarine pens at Lorient, aircraft factories at Schweinfurt, ball-bearing plants at Regensburg. They'd fought through fighter attacks that turned the sky into a hurricane of tracers and cannon fire. They'd watched bombers explode beside them, watched parachutes blossom over Germany, watched friends die in ways that made grown men vomit when they landed. And they'd noticed something about their pilot. Hughes flew every mission exactly the same way, smooth, controlled, utterly predictable. He never broke formation, never deviated from the flight plan, never did anything that violated standard procedure. He was, by every measurable metric, a textbook bomber pilot, reliable, steady, exactly what doctrine required. But his crew also noticed what he did between missions. While other pilots drank or slept or tried to forget, Hughes studied after-action reports. He read accounts of bomber losses, analyzed fighter attack patterns, mapped flak concentration zones. He spent hours with the maintenance crews, learning how battle damage affected aircraft performance, which systems could fail without being fatal, how much structural damage the B-17 could sustain and still fly. Staff Sergeant Kowalski, the flight engineer, found Hughes one night sitting in Queen of Diamonds' cockpit with the engines cold and the base asleep. Just sitting there in darkness, hands on the controls, running through scenarios. "What happens if the hydraulics fail during a fighter attack?" Hughes asked. "Can we maintain controlled flight if the entire tail section is damaged? If we lose 2 engines on the same wing, what's the minimum airspeed for controlled flight?" Kowalski had no answers. These weren't normal questions. Most pilots didn't want to think about catastrophic failures. They flew their missions, followed procedure, and hoped luck stayed with them. Hughes seemed to be preparing for something specific, some particular disaster that he could see coming but couldn't prevent. The other pilots noticed too. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the Harvard graduate who'd bunked near Hughes during training, flew as a squadron operations officer now. He'd survived 14 missions and was rotating home in 2 weeks. Over drinks one evening in December, he mentioned Hughes to a group of veteran pilots. Farm boy's still at it, Webb said. 17 missions, not a scratch on him. Flies like a machine. Never deviates, never improvises. I thought he'd wash out or crack up, but turns out doctrine works if you follow it exactly. Captain Richard Holloway, a pilot with 22 missions, disagreed. I've watched Hughes fly. He's good, but he's also lucky. Hasn't been in a situation where the book doesn't have an answer. What happens when fighters press a real attack, when your formation breaks up, when you're alone and damaged? That's when you find out what a pilot's really made of. Nobody argued. They'd all seen it happen, crews that flew perfect missions for months, then died on a single bad day when circumstances overwhelmed doctrine. Combat was statistics. Play the game long enough and the house always won. But Hughes kept preparing. He practiced emergency procedures in his head during missions, visualizing control inputs for situations the manual said were unrecoverable. He tested responses during routine flights, subtle movements, testing how the aircraft responded to unconventional control inputs, building an intuitive map of what Queen of Diamonds could really do versus what the book said she could do. His navigator, Lieutenant Chen, asked him once why he bothered. If things get that bad, Chen said, we're already dead. Why not just accept it? Hughes thought for a long moment before answering. Because accepting it means 9 men die. Not accepting it means maybe we find a way they don't. He paused, then added, a tractor's just dead weight until you figure out how to make it move. Same with a damaged bomber. It's not dead until it stops flying. Chen didn't understand, but he dropped the subject. Farm boy philosophy. It didn't make sense to city kids who thought machines had fixed limitations, who believed the manual defined reality. But it made perfect sense to someone who'd spent his childhood convincing equipment to exceed its design specifications simply because there was no other option. Stay with me because this next part is crucial. On Hughes' 18th mission, a raid against Emden on December 11, 1943, everything he'd been preparing for finally happened. December 11, 1943. Target, U-boat facilities at Emden, Germany. Weather forecast, poor visibility, cloud cover at 15,000 feet, chance of icing conditions. Expected opposition, moderate. The briefing officer's voice carried the usual calm indifference, as if describing a training exercise rather than a mission where 20-30 men might die before sunset. Queen of Diamonds lifted off at 8:47 hours. The formation assembly was chaotic. Heavy cloud cover scattered the aircraft, making it nearly impossible to maintain visual contact. By the time they reached the Dutch coast, the neat combat box had degraded into a loose gaggle of bombers, each pilot fighting to stay with the formation while navigating through clouds that turned the sky into a white void. They climbed above the weather at 24,000 feet. The formation had lost coherence. Instead of tight defensive positions, bombers were spread across 3 miles of sky, gaps large enough for fighters to exploit. The group commander's voice came over the radio. Tighten up, close those gaps. But closing gaps in combat formation isn't simple. It requires precise airspeed matching, altitude control, and spatial awareness. Many of the replacement pilots were on their second or third missions. They were doing their best just to stay airborne. The fighters came earlier than expected. FW-190s from Jagdschwader 1, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings. They'd been tracking the formation since it crossed the coast, waiting for exactly this moment. When the bombers were scattered, when defensive fire zones had gaps, when individual aircraft were vulnerable. The first attack hit the lead element. 4 FW-190s in a coordinated dive, 20 cannons firing in synchronization. The lead bomber staggered, lost 2 engines, dropped out of formation. No parachutes. She went into a spin at 23,000 feet and never recovered. Hughes saw the attack developing, saw the fighters repositioning for a second pass. Saw the formation continuing to deteriorate as pilots overcorrected, trying to close gaps while staying clear of other aircraft. The doctrine was failing in real time. The defensive formation, the core principle of bomber survival, was falling apart. A FW-190 came straight at Queen of Diamonds from 12 o'clock high. Closing speed, 450 miles per hour. Time to impact, 8 seconds. Hughes could see the muzzle flashes from the fighter's guns, could see the tracer rounds arcing toward his windscreen. Klein, the bombardier, was firing the nose guns, 50 caliber tracers reaching out toward the diving fighter. Standard procedure, hold course and altitude, trust your gunners. Maintain formation discipline, the fighter will break off or die. Those were the rules. Hughes broke them. He pushed the control yoke forward sharply while simultaneously rolling 15 degrees left. Not a radical maneuver, nothing that would scatter his formation, but enough to change Queen of Diamonds' position by 30 feet in 2 seconds. The FW-190's cannon fire passed through the space where they should have been. The fighter flashed overhead close enough that Hughes could see the pilot's face. McCarthy, the co-pilot, stared at Hughes. "Did you just maintain position?" Hughes said calmly, bringing the aircraft back to formation altitude and heading. The entire maneuver had taken 4 seconds. None of the other bombers in his element had been affected. But Queen of Diamonds was still flying, and the FW-190's burst had missed. The intercom erupted. "Skipper, that was incredible. How did you—" "Holy hell, we should be dead." "Maintain radio discipline?" Hughes cut them off. But his hands were shaking slightly on the controls, not from fear, from the realization that what he'd just done, what he'd been practicing for months, actually worked. The B-17 could evade, not with wild aerobatics, not with maneuvers that would tear the wings off, but with precise, calculated movements timed to exploit the fighter's attack geometry. They reached Emden, dropped their bombs through heavy flak, turned for home. The fighters came back twice more, and both times Hughes made small, precise, evasive movements, never breaking formation, never doing anything dramatic, just changing Queen of Diamonds' position enough to spoil the attacker's aim. They landed at Molesworth with minor damage and 0 casualties. The debriefing was tense. Hughes described his evasive maneuvers in technical terms, explaining angles and timing and control inputs. The intelligence officer listened, made notes, said nothing, but the other pilots heard about it within hours. Farm Boy had broken doctrine and survived. Some thought it was luck, others thought it was brilliance. A few thought it was dangerous, that teaching bomber pilots they could evade would lead to formation breakdowns and higher losses. However, the real controversy was just beginning, because what Hughes had done on a single mission was about to spread through the bomber groups like wildfire. Word spread fast in the close quarters of an operational bomber base. By the evening of December 11th, every pilot at Molesworth had heard some version of what Hughes had done. The stories grew with each retelling. Some said he'd barrel-rolled the B-17, others claimed he'd done an inverted pass under a fighter. The reality was more subtle but no less significant. He'd proven that calculated evasion was possible without sacrificing formation integrity. The 303rd Bomb Group's commanding officer, Colonel William Jenkins, called Hughes to his office on December 13th. Jenkins was a pre-war Army Air Corps officer, a by-the-book commander who'd flown bombers when the doctrine was still being written. He looked at Hughes for a long moment before speaking. "I've read your after-action report. I've also heard the stories circulating among the enlisted men. I need to know exactly what you did up there." Hughes explained again, the geometry of the attack, the timing of his control inputs, the minimal deviation from formation position, the fact that his wingmen hadn't been affected. Jenkins listened without interrupting, then leaned back in his chair. "You understand that what you're describing contradicts official tactical doctrine. The manual is explicit. Bomber pilots maintain heading and altitude during fighter attacks. Formation discipline is absolute." "Yes, sir, I understand that's the doctrine. But you chose to ignore it." Hughes paused before answering. "I chose to interpret it differently, sir. Maintaining formation discipline doesn't necessarily mean remaining motionless. It means maintaining your position relative to other aircraft. If I can evade and immediately return to position without affecting the formation, then I've maintained discipline while increasing survivability." Jenkins studied the young pilot. Farm boy logic wrapped in technical language, dangerous thinking, or breakthrough tactics. He couldn't decide. "You're aware that if this technique is adopted widely and goes wrong, we could see formation breakdowns across the entire bomber stream, collisions, gaps that fighters exploit, chaos." "Yes, sir, which is why it requires judgment. A pilot needs to know his aircraft's capabilities, understand attack geometry, and have the skill to execute precise movements under stress. Not every pilot can do that. Including you, Lieutenant. You've flown 18 missions. That doesn't make you an expert." "No, sir, but it makes me someone who's survived 18 missions by preparing for situations the manual says are hopeless." Jenkins dismissed him without approval or condemnation, but he didn't order Hughes to stop. The unspoken message was clear. If your technique works and doesn't endanger other aircraft, we'll tolerate it. But if it goes wrong, you'll be held accountable. The other pilots remained divided. Some started practicing subtle evasive movements on training flights. Others doubled down on doctrine, convinced that Hughes had simply been lucky and that his technique would eventually get him killed. The mockery continued, but now it carried an edge of uncertainty. Farm Boy wasn't washing out. He was developing a reputation as someone who might actually know something the rest of them didn't. By late February 1944, Hughes had completed 23 missions. Queen of Diamonds had been hit by flak 14 times, engaged by fighters on 11 missions, and had limped home on 3 engines twice. But she'd never failed to return. The crew's confidence in their pilot had evolved into something close to faith. Whatever situation developed, they believed Hughes would find a way through it. Then came March 4, 1944. The briefing room filled with more pilots than usual. The mission list showed maximum effort, every available aircraft. The intelligence officer pulled back the curtain covering the wall map, revealing a red ribbon stretching from England deep into Germany. The target marker sat on Berlin. The room went silent. Berlin, Big B, the most heavily defended city in Europe, the target that every bomber crew feared and every fighter pilot in Germany would scramble to defend. Expected losses, 15 to 20%. That meant 30 to 40 aircraft wouldn't come home. 300 to 400 men dead, wounded, or captured. The briefing officer's voice was steady as he outlined the mission parameters. Primary target, ball-bearing factories in the Erkner district. Secondary targets, rail yards and industrial facilities. Total force, 660 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s. Fighter escort would take them to the German border but couldn't reach Berlin. The bombers would be alone over the target for 45 minutes. Hughes sat in the third row listening to the details. Flak gun positions, over 400 heavy batteries plus hundreds of light guns. Fighter opposition estimates ranged from 200 to 300 aircraft, including the elite defense of the Reich squadrons equipped with heavily armed variants designed specifically to destroy bombers. Weather, poor visibility, possible icing conditions, variable winds at altitude. The briefing officer concluded, "Gentlemen, this is what we've been preparing for. Berlin is the heart of Nazi Germany's war production. We hit it hard enough, we shorten the war. We save Allied lives. The cost will be high, but the mission is essential." The pilots filed out in silence. Some went to write letters home, the letters that would only be mailed if they didn't return. Others went to the chapel. Hughes went to the flight line to Queen of Diamonds and spent an hour in the cockpit running through emergency procedures in his mind, because he knew with absolute certainty that this mission would be different. Berlin wouldn't be like the other targets. Berlin would test everything he'd learned, everything he'd prepared for. What happened next shocked everyone, because the mission to Berlin on March 6th would prove to be the single most violent air battle of the entire European war. March 6, 1944, 5:30 hours, the crew of Queen of Diamonds gathered in the pre-dawn darkness outside their aircraft. 9 men, breath visible in the cold English morning, each dealing with fear in their own way. Kowalski chain-smoked 3 cigarettes. Chen checked and rechecked his navigation charts. Klein cleaned his glasses compulsively. The gunners, Staff Sergeant Tom Rizzo in the ball turret, Sergeant Pete Morrison and Sergeant Jack Hayes in the waist positions, Sergeant Eddie Walsh in the tail, stood in a tight cluster, speaking in low voices about anything except the mission ahead. Hughes walked around Queen of Diamonds one final time, touching her patched aluminum skin like a farmer checking livestock before market. 24 missions together. She'd brought them home every time, sometimes barely, but always. He needed her to do it one more time, just one more. At 6:47 hours, engines coughed to life across Molesworth Airfield. The sound was thunder, hundreds of Wright Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, combining into a roar that shook windows in villages 5 miles away. Queen of Diamonds' 4 engines caught and settled into a rough synchronization, propellers chopping the morning air. Takeoff at 7:12 hours. The runway disappeared beneath them, England fell away, and they climbed through cloud cover into brilliant sunlight at 15,000 feet. The formation assembly took 90 minutes, 303rd Bomb Group joining with the 379th, the 384th, the entire 1st Bombardment Division stacking into combat boxes that stretched across 20 miles of sky. By 900 hours, 660 heavy bombers were droning eastward in formation, their contrails marking white lines across the blue vault of heaven. The fighter escort met them over the North Sea. P-47 Thunderbolts, weaving above the bomber stream, their pilots knowing they could only accompany the bombers to the German border before fuel limitations forced them to turn back. After that, the bombers would be alone for 2 hours. 1 hour penetrating to Berlin, 45 minutes over target, 1 hour fighting their way back to where the escorts could meet them again. They crossed into German airspace at 10:47 hours. The P-47s waggled their wings, good luck, we'll be waiting, and turned for home. The bombers flew on alone, 660 aircraft, 6,600 men, flying into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. The first flak appeared at 11:03 hours. Light at first, probing bursts from isolated batteries tracking the formation's altitude and heading. The gunners were calibrating their aim, preparing for the main barrage. Hughes watched the black puffs bloom and dissipate, calculating trajectories, trying to predict where the heavy flak would concentrate. But there was no pattern. Berlin's defense grid was too dense, too coordinated. Wherever the bombers flew, they would fly through steel. The fighters came at 11:18 hours. First in small groups, 3 Me-109s here, 4 FW-190s there, testing the formation's defensive fire, probing for weak points. Then in larger formations, then in waves. By 11:30 hours, the radio was chaos with fighter calls from every position in the bomber stream. Hundreds of single-engine fighters swarming through the formation like hornets, attacking from every angle, pressing their attacks to suicidally close range. Hughes flew through it all with mechanical precision. He'd positioned Queen of Diamonds in the low element of the lead squadron, a vulnerable position, but one that gave him maneuver room if needed. The aircraft around him started taking hits. A B-17 3 positions ahead lost its entire nose section to a head-on attack, Klein's position, the bombardier's station. The aircraft fell away trailing fire, spinning toward the earth 26,000 feet below. The flak intensified as they approached Berlin, not the scattered bursts from before, but a continuous barrage that turned the sky black. The shockwaves hammered at Queen of Diamonds, rattling her frame, making instruments jump on their panels. Shell fragments pinged against aluminum skin. The No. 3 engine took a hit, not fatal, but oil pressure dropped and temperature climbed. Hughes adjusted power settings, compensated with rudder trim, kept formation. At 11:47 hours, they could see Berlin on the horizon. The city sprawled beneath a pall of smoke from previous raids, fires still burning from yesterday's attack. The flak was a solid wall of bursts, so dense it seemed impossible that anything could fly through it and survive. But the bombers pressed forward, closing on their target, flying into hell because there was no other choice. McCarthy, the co-pilot, keyed the intercom. His voice was tight with controlled fear. "Bob, this is insane. We're not going to make it through this." Hughes didn't take his eyes off the formation lead aircraft. "We'll make it. Just fly the aircraft." But even as he said it, he knew the worst was still ahead. They hadn't reached the target yet. The really heavy flak, the coordinated barrage from Berlin's main defense batteries, was about to begin. And somewhere in the sky above them, more German fighters were climbing to altitude, positioning for attacks on the bombers as they made their bomb runs. This is where things took a dramatic turn, because what happened in the next 12 minutes would determine whether Queen of Diamonds and her crew would survive to see England again. 11:52 hours, 27,000 feet above Berlin. Queen of Diamonds shuddered as flak bursts bracketed the formation. The target was 3 minutes ahead, the ball-bearing plants in Erkner visible through breaks in the smoke. Klein was already in his bombing position. I pressed to the Norden bomb site, making final calculations. The bomb bay doors were open. Every aircraft in the formation was locked into its final approach, flying straight and level, predictable, exactly where the German gunners expected them to be. Hughes saw the fighters first. 6 FW-190s diving from 32,000 feet, positioned perfectly for a head-on attack on the lead squadron. But they weren't aiming for the lead aircraft. They were coming for the low element. They were coming for Queen of Diamonds. "Fighters 12 o'clock high," Hughes called calmly over the intercom. "Everyone, this is it. Stay sharp." The nose guns opened up, Klein firing controlled bursts from the bombardier's position. The top turret rotated, Kowalski tracking the diving fighters, but Hughes could see the geometry. 6 fighters, coordinated attack, closing speed over 500 miles per hour. They weren't going to miss. At least 2 of those fighters would get clean shots before passing through the formation. And at this range, with 20 cannons, 2 clean shots meant Queen of Diamonds would cease to exist. Time compressed. Hughes' mind processed the tactical situation in fractions of a second. Standard procedure. Maintain heading, trust the defensive guns, accept the hits, hope the structural damage wasn't catastrophic. His training screamed at him to hold course. Every regulation demanded he maintain formation discipline during the bomb run. But his instinct, the same instinct that had kept stubborn farm equipment running, that had questioned doctrine from his first day of training, that had spent hundreds of hours preparing for exactly this moment, told him something different. The manual said a B-17 couldn't roll. Too heavy, too slow, too much structural stress. But the manual was written by engineers who'd never been shot at by 6 fighters at once. 5 seconds to impact. The fighters' muzzle flashes were visible now. Cannon rounds and tracer fire arcing toward Queen of Diamonds. Klein's nose guns still firing, but the fighters weren't breaking off. They were committed. They were going to kill his aircraft and his crew. Hughes made his decision. He pushed the control yoke forward and to the left in one smooth motion, simultaneously applying full left rudder. Queen of Diamonds' nose dropped sharply, and she began to roll. Not a fighter's barrel roll, not an aerobatic maneuver, but a controlled, powered roll using every bit of momentum and every trick Hughes had practiced in his mind for 18 months. The world inverted. The sky became the ground became the sky. Kowalski, standing in the top turret, found himself suddenly looking straight down at Berlin through what had been the floor. The ball turret gunner, Rizzo, screamed as his position rolled through 180 degrees. Loose equipment floated in momentary weightlessness. The altimeter unwound, 26,800 feet, 26,600 feet, 26,400 feet. The fighter's cannon fire passed through empty air. Queen of Diamonds had dropped and rolled out of the attack path so suddenly that the German pilots didn't have time to adjust their aim. 6 aircraft traveling at 500 miles per hour don't turn on a dime. They flashed past, missing by margins measured in feet, their pilots no doubt as shocked as Hughes' crew. Hughes reversed the controls. Right rudder yoked to the right, throttles adjusted for asymmetric thrust to help the roll. Queen of Diamonds came through the bottom of the maneuver inverted, then continued rolling back to upright. The whole evolution took 7 seconds. 7 seconds of controlled chaos that violated every principle of heavy bomber operations. They'd lost 800 feet of altitude but were still airborne. All 4 engines still running, wings still attached, fuselage intact. The structural stress had been enormous. Hughes heard metal groaning, felt vibrations through the controls that hadn't been there before, but the B-17 had held together. The aircraft that engineers said couldn't roll had just rolled. The intercom exploded with voices. "What the hell? Are we still alive? Skipper, that was. Jesus Christ, we're still flying." "Check for damage." Hughes cut through the chaos, his voice steady despite hands that were now shaking on the controls. "Kowalski, give me a systems check. Gunners, watch for more fighters. McCarthy, get us back to altitude. Klein, can you still make the bomb run?" Klein's voice came back, higher pitched than normal but functional. Yes, bomb sight is still calibrated. I can make the run, but Skipper, we're out of formation. We're alone." Hughes looked up through the windscreen. Queen of Diamonds had rolled and dropped out of her position. The formation was 800 feet above them now, continuing toward the target. Standard procedure said to abort, jettison bombs safe, and run for home alone, which meant running a gauntlet of fighters without the protection of formation defensive fire. It was suicide either way. But you won't believe what happened during the next 3 minutes, because Hughes wasn't done defying doctrine yet. Hughes pushed the throttles to maximum continuous power. The 4 right Cyclone engines roared, straining to pull 65,000 pounds of aircraft back to formation altitude while fighting through the turbulent air created by hundreds of propellers churning the sky above them. Queen of Diamonds climbed, slowly, painfully slowly, back toward the bomber stream. But climbing meant they were exposed. A single B-17, below and behind the formation, was exactly what German fighter pilots hunted for. Damaged stragglers were easy prey, picked off one by one as they limped away from the protection of massed defensive fire. And Queen of Diamonds looked like a straggler. "Fighters 4 o'clock level?" Walsh's voice from the tail position, urgent but controlled. 2 Me-109s had spotted them, were banking to attack position. They'd seen the lone bomber, assumed it was damaged, and were moving in for the kill. Hughes had perhaps 30 seconds before they opened fire. Not enough time to reach the formation. Not enough altitude to use evasive maneuvers effectively. He could try another roll, but the airframe had already been stressed beyond design limits. A second violent maneuver might be the one that broke something critical. A wing spar, a control surface, a structural member already weakened by flak damage they hadn't discovered yet. But staying straight and level meant dying. So Hughes did something that made sense only if you understood how he thought about machinery and physics and the negotiable nature of limitations. He didn't roll. He didn't dive. Instead, he put Queen of Diamonds into a climbing spiral, a continuous turn that bled off airspeed but also made them an impossible target to track. The B-17 corkscrewed upward, her wingtip describing a helix through the sky, moving just unpredictably enough that the Me-109's attack solutions fell apart. The German fighters made 2 passes. Both times their cannon fire missed, not by much, but in aerial combat, a miss by 10 feet is as good as a miss by a mile. The fighters couldn't maintain the slow airspeed needed to stay with Queen of Diamonds' spiral without stalling. They broke off, looking for easier targets. There were plenty available. 11:56 hours. Queen of Diamonds leveled off at 26,900 feet, slotting back into the formation just as the lead aircraft's bomb bay doors opened. They'd made it back. Out of position, they should have been in the low element, but Hughes had inserted them into a gap in the high element. But they were with the formation, protected by overlapping fields of fire, no longer alone. "Klein," Hughes called over the intercom, "can you still make the drop?" "Negative on primary bomb site. It got knocked off calibration during the roll. But I can drop on the lead aircraft. When they release, I release." "Do it." At 11:58 hours, the lead bombardier toggled his release. 60 B-17s dropped their bombs in near synchronization, 360,000 pounds of high explosives falling toward the Erkner ball-bearing plants. Klein hit the release, and Queen of Diamonds lurched upward as 6,000 pounds left the bomb bay. Mission accomplished. Now they just had to survive the next 2 hours getting home. The formation turned west, leaving Berlin behind in smoke and flame. But the fighters weren't done. They pressed attacks all the way to the German border, wave after wave, sometimes 6 or 8 fighters hitting a single combat box simultaneously. Hughes flew with every sense heightened, watching for the telltale glints of sunlight on canopy glass that signaled incoming fighters, making small adjustments to Queen of Diamonds' position that made attacking pilots' calculations just slightly wrong. The number 3 engine finally gave up at 12:47 hours, 50 miles inside Germany. The temperature had been climbing since the flak hit 2 hours earlier. Now it redlined, and Hughes had no choice but to feather the propeller and shut it down before it caught fire. 3 engines, still flyable, but their airspeed dropped. They started falling behind the formation. McCarthy looked at Hughes, fear evident in his eyes. "We're not going to make it back to formation on 3 engines." "We don't need to catch the formation," Hughes replied. "We just need to stay close enough that the fighters think twice before attacking." He adjusted power on the remaining 3 engines, nursing every bit of thrust, keeping Queen of Diamonds within visual range of the bomber stream. Close enough to look protected. Far enough back that any fighter attacking them would have to run a gauntlet of bomber defensive fire to reach them. It worked. The fighters went after easier targets, bombers that had fallen farther behind, that were visibly damaged, trailing smoke or losing altitude. Queen of Diamonds limped westward alone but unmolested, her crew silent now, everyone focused on their stations, scanning the sky, waiting for the next crisis that would test whether their pilot could conjure another miracle. They crossed the German border at 13:42 hours. The P-47 escorts were there, exactly where they'd promised to be, their presence transforming the tactical situation instantly. The German fighters broke off and turned for home. The bombers, or what was left of them, continued toward England. Hughes counted the aircraft in visual range. 26 B-17s visible, the combat box that had left England with 42 aircraft. 16 bombers hadn't made it. 160 men dead, missing, or captured. Queen of Diamonds and her crew of 9 had survived by fractions of seconds, by decisions made in moments of terror, by a pilot who refused to accept that doctrine defined the limits of possible. Yet one final challenge remained before they could call this mission complete. Because 3-engine landings were notoriously difficult, and Hughes was about to attempt one in an aircraft that had been structurally stressed beyond anything in its maintenance history.